I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice: don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate. Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. You probably don't know this, but for the last couple of years, I've been interviewing impact fund managers on another podcast called Sound Funding. I've just wrapped up the series of 25 episodes, and in this final episode, Ben DeVries of Impact Europe interviews yours truly. Here's the episode. I hope you enjoy it.
Ryan, welcome. Can you start out by taking us through some of the many hats you wear?
First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. It's fun to be a guest on an EVPA or Impact Europe Now podcast. So thanks a lot, and I'm glad to be here. I do wear a number of different hats, and I have kind of over the course of my lifetime. I guess if I had to choose one, even though I'm not doing this right now, I would call myself a founder. When I was a teenager, I founded an e-commerce company that I sold. We had a small exit around, 1999. And then from there, I started a nonprofit, a public foundation in Canada called, fittingly, Canada Helps. And that's grown substantially. It's, now 4 years old, and has processed over $3 billion for Canadian charities. So in some ways, it's my unicorn, but it's a nonprofit. So oops. And I funded that kind of, at the beginning with some of the money, with all of the money that I made from the exit. And then I did some university, and I started a renewable energy company in the biogas space, which I ran for a number of years. And when we exited that, I moved in 2010 to Berlin, and started working, on my own, and also then with the BMW Foundation, like the car company, working to help European social entrepreneurs, help set up the, nascent European impact investing space as much as I kind of could. And so that kind of got me into my second role, which is helping impact companies and impact investors to match funding, to get more funding, to do kind of everything that we can to use financial markets or entrepreneurship and business to deliver on impact missions. And so that can all fall into a bucket called consultant, I guess, which is what I do a lot of right now, which, I don't think it ever kind of really matches what the work is, but it's, connecting, and it's working on projects, it's kicking things off, and that type of thing. So, so that's the kind of catch-all. I also am an investor, and personally, I focus on really early stage companies that generally are in the alternative proteins or alternative materials space, because for me, it's about removing animals from the supply chain. I'm an animal lover. And so this is, it's ClimateTech as well, of course. But that's for me the focus. I've invested in about 27 companies that fit that bill. And then with, some climate tech funds that I help out with, I more broadly kind of climate tech stuff. And then lastly, but probably most importantly for me right now is over these past 2 years is as a volunteer. working to help in Ukraine. At first, it was largely about helping with the refugee crisis, and then after the last sort of year and a half, it's been more and more helping with the military in whatever ways I can, bringing gear to them, buying up SUVs, that type of thing, and it's my little drop in the bucket, I guess, of doing my bit to try to prevent World War III, which I say jokingly, but also I definitely think is if you're an impact, you should be doing something about this developing and problematic situation.
Yeah, jokingly but seriously as well. Wow. I mean, I feel like there's so much to get through with all of those hats. But if you had to, and I recognize that each of them would have its own real spark of inspiration behind it. But would you take us through just one thing that inspired you to go in one of those directions?
Well, the easiest, aside from the war starting or the full scale invasion starting in Ukraine, which is kind of just like a moment, a day. If I think of my investment thesis for alternative proteins, my impact investment thesis, I can very clearly draw a straight line to the person who opened that world up to me. And that's Bruce Friedrich, who is the founder and president of the Good Food Institute based in Washington. And he's someone who I think just gets it in terms of, he can understand macroeconomics, but also very closely understands human behavior and all these kinds of things. And so it's built this organization that's, spans all continents, and I think is doing some of the most interesting work to support the burgeoning alternative proteins and alternative materials industries. And I had the good fortune of being able to finally interview him on my podcast and to thank him for being that influence on me. And so he's somebody who really understands that to improve human, animal, and ecological welfare, you have to make things cheap, easy, and accessible. And so that's kind of a thesis that aligns with sort of my more practical side, and is something I can get behind. So Bruce would be my my number one inspiration for that.
Yeah, and I had the good fortune of listening to that episode. In fact,
cool.
And I think it's an excellent entry point to what you're doing with your podcast. But before we get into the nitty gritty of that, what got you into podcasting just as a format?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's not that I said one day I want to be a podcast host. It's more because working in the space for so long, there's so many people doing the most important and interesting work out there. And, and nobody knows their names and nobody knows their stories. And meanwhile, we have, how many thousands of podcasts that are all about tech founders and stuff like that. And, we celebrate these people because they made $1 billion. And if you stop and ask, what did they actually contribute to the world? Maybe they made you buy more stuff that you don't need, or they improved your efficiency at work by 5% or something like that. I mean, fair enough, but it felt overweighted to really just celebrating like kind of this pure, this pure tech founder kind of thing. And meanwhile, there are like all these great people, so many scientists and activists and academics and and founders that are doing important work. And so, so I wanted to tell their stories, and and in the case of Sound Funding, there are so many people who are funding this kind of work who are just very much in the background unless you're in the space, right? You would never know their names. Whereas a lot of people, could name the big Silicon Valley VCs and stuff like that. And so I wanted to, again, in some kind of tiny little way, correct for that and just expose those stories. So that's why.
Yeah. And they do have interesting stories, as your run with Sound Funding bore out, episode by episode. Can you share some things you learned along the way with making Sound Funding?
Yeah, I mean the really cool thing about so that I guess that's 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago that we started this, and the interesting thing is I thought it would be really hard to get guests, and there would be a lot of research and stuff like that, but in fact, especially with things like LinkedIn, you can see, there people are there in your feed and they're writing really interesting things. And you can, if you write to them and say, do you want to be on this podcast? People almost always say yes. So I think, and I think I've maybe had like 2 or 3 people say no. And it was always because like they had a baby last week or they're too busy. And, it's never no, it's always later. And so, that's really interesting. So that just also if I don't think I've totally taken advantage of this yet, but the access that you can get to people, you can, especially once you've got some track record and the podcast has been around a while, people, you can start getting kind of some bigger names who definitely would not, say yes to a 60-minute Zoom with you. And fair enough and understandably so. So that's one, it's a great way as a host to connect people. So, one thing I love is I always book, most of my episodes are half an hour, but I always book an hour. And usually it's the first time a lot of the times it's the first time I've talked to someone, and you get to know them kind of for half an hour as well. And, without hitting record, and you can do so much connection with people, and that I find that really helpful. And so you can kind of like serve your base as well. And then I found myself a lot of times, especially as you start to get more and more episodes, that you're in a conversation with someone, and they'll say something, you'll say, oh yeah, you should check out episode 7. You start sort of like referring to your library of episodes. Like I'm not going to explain this to you now. Go check out the concept in episode, 7. And then maybe lastly is that interviewing is a skill. And if I look at, the early ones versus the early episodes versus kind of the later on ones, you get more comfortable with it. You get kind of better at it. And so it's a skill that's been fun to develop and that I'm continuing to develop. I will be as long as I'm doing this.
I'm wondering if clearly you're an excellent interviewer. If you listen to all of those podcasts, does some of your style of interviewing come from your background as a founder, as a consultant?
Yeah, I think, as a founder, as an investor, a lot of times and a consultant, a lot of times it's almost like an investigative journalist skill, right? So if I'm doing due diligence on something or looking at an opportunity, I always pretend basically like how would an investigative journalist look at this? And knowing when to push, knowing when kind of to ask the follow-up question. And yeah, so I think, and also trying to kind of figure out what matters, right? So it's fine to go down rabbit holes, but to make sure that the overall kind of superstructure holds of like, why are you doing this? Is this a problem that matters? Like, so I try to start with some of these big, meta questions, as well before kind of zeroing in.
Makes sense. Well, I want to resurrect a sound funding question for you, because I noticed you asked this one at the end of a lot of episodes. What is the thing to do in Vienna, where you're based?
So, I have to say I'm a huge fan of Vienna. I moved here from Berlin 2.5 years ago just because I love the city so much, and I was getting tired of Berlin. There's so much going on here. The funny thing is, everyone has this impression of Vienna as being kind of like, they think of classical music and waltzing and stuff like that, right? And it's actually quite a dynamic city. It's a university town. There's a lot going on, right? There's there's a great music scene that is not just Mozart and Strauss. But one of the things that's great about it is that you're always very close to nature. So, I live right downtown Vienna. But in 10 minutes, I can be on the dog beach, on the Danube Island. And that's one of my favorite places, I think, in the world. So I'll go there. I've got a Great Dane, and I'll go swimming with her. and then I'll just lie on the beach and read a book while she's running around playing with all the other dogs and you know, chasing poodles in the water and stuff like that. And it's 10 minutes away, but I feel like I'm in Croatia or something like that. So, you know, that's really special. Not a lot of major cities or, you know, world capitals have the ability where you can just sort of jump into the river right out front. Right. But, you know, it's a very clean city in that sense.
And your dog's name is?
Gracie.
Gracie.
Gracie,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like Gracie is living her best life.
She's pretty happy dog, yeah.
Well, this is a bit connected to, the question on style of interview. But from listening to quite a lot of your podcasting, you seem to bring your investor perspective in particular to a lot of it. Now, what I'm wondering is that perspective something that's kind of always on in your life? Is it hard to set that aside while moving through the world?
I do often look at things with kind of an investor lens. I find it much harder, and maybe because I started so young as a founder, but I have a really hard time turning off my founder lens. That's much harder. And so whenever I'm always looking for inefficiencies and wondering, you know, is there an opportunity to do that better? And is that opportunity like a company or a nonprofit? So I'm more looking at it that way, I would say.
Interesting. Well, you know, it leads me to want to revise my hats metaphor to the lenses metaphor.
Don't mix them.
Yeah, I'm trying not to. Okay. Well, let's talk about the current podcast, another ClimateTech podcast. I'm a fan. I love the name, but why does the world need another ClimateTech podcast?
Well, the thing is, so again, my starting point wasn't I want to start a podcast. My starting point was, where are the podcasts telling these stories? And I really couldn't find any, you know. I mean, since then I've found a couple. And if I could just give a shout out to two of them that I really like. One's called Climate Insiders with Johan Bernot, who's a ClimateTech investor himself. When he says insiders, it really is insiders, and it's very much kind of industry driven. So I don't think it's kind of super accessible to just the average person. Another one called Clean Techies with Silas Manor and Somil Agarwal. And I did a crossover episode with these guys. They're based in New York. It's a bit more of a US focus. So, you know, I found those, and then there's mine. And beyond that, there's not a ton. But when I set out, I really couldn't find many at all. And I did, originally I called it the ClimateTech podcast. And actually the UN had one that they ran for like about a year or something out of Denmark, and then stopped in 2022 or something like that. And I thought, okay, well, this one's kind of doesn't look like it's going forward. But then I thought, okay, no, I don't want to deal with like UN lawyers or something like the copyright issues. So I just decided to call it another ClimateTech podcast. And I think it also kind of represents, you know, I try to keep things a little bit looser. It's not a super technical one. I try to instill a bit of kind of wry humor here and there and keep things light. So, you know, I feel like it ends up being on brand, even though, you know, that it came first before we were even doing anything. We being me.
Switching gears a little bit, I was reading a recent LinkedIn post of yours where you talked about looking for good judgment in founders. And I love the post, but that quality, judgment, seems so elusive. How do you find it in people? How do you get to that?
You know, I think you can find it when you get to know people. My challenge, you know, I wrote this from the perspective as an investor. My challenge is, how do you get to know people, you know, in the phase before you write the check? Because you get to know them pretty well once they have the money in the bank, and, you know, it's a multi-year kind of relationship, for better or for worse. And the answer is I'm working on it. So that, you know, that post seemed to get a fair bit of resonance on LinkedIn, but it was literally just something I whipped together in a coffee shop and kind of in 5 minutes, and just kind of came to my mind. And it's something I want to work on. And in the heady days, sort of up until 2021 in the investment space, where everything was, this is a hot deal, say yes, say yes, you've got 10 minutes, to get on it because it's moving fast, and you're like, whoa. And now where things are, swung probably a little too far on the other side, I think there's now, once we find equilibrium, there will be a way to have these conversations and to be able to assess people for, and test these kinds of things out. And what I'm actually working on right now, as I come up to a period of making some new investments, is like kind of a formal interview process where I'll design and kind of engineer questions to find out some things about people, and judgment, because, if when you're investing at the pre-seed stage, it's just all about the team, and people are making so many judgments every single day. It's going to be really, that's what you need. You need, to screen for ethics and these kinds of things, but they just need to be able to make good decisions, 9 times out of 10. That's the name of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In ClimateTech, in impact, there are lots of people who switch careers to do these things, right? So I'm wondering if you envision a future where this is the career you choose as a young person, and maybe from your perspective as a young person who really started out as a founder, as opposed to switch to this. And if so, how is the system going to allow that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's a definitional question here because it's changing also, right? So what's climate tech? And, climate tech 10 years ago is kind of a niche. 10 years from now, it's everything. And the metaphor I use for that is the internet, right? Because when I started in the 90s, I started an internet company. How often do you hear someone say they're starting an internet company today, right? And it's because the internet is like, it underlies, everything that you do. And so then you break that into like, I'm building a customer relationship management company or whatever. And all these, all of these things have the undercarriage of the internet. And I think the same will be said of climate change of climate tech pretty soon. So, all jobs will kind of switch into that, and we'll have that element kind of underlying it. I think that's happening. Still today, it's like people have to make that conscious choice that they want to commit to that, because we're still in this like early part of the transition. And I get in trouble when I do talks at universities and say, especially at business schools. I have an MBA, and when I talk at business schools, I often say, like, you have a choice right now. You can go work for McKinsey, but know that you're actively making the world a worse place. And I don't, it's one of the great things about being an independent person is that I can say things like that, because yes, I mean, sure, there are things that are changing at places like that and these big consultancies, but they're also still, their biggest, one of their biggest clients is Saudi Aramco and these types of things. And they're talking out of both sides of their mouth right now. And I think we need to call these kinds of things out and make it clear with young people, which is what I'm trying to do. And people will they look at me like I'm crazy sometimes when I give these talks about climate tech. But this is right. And somebody has to say that. And so like, I try to, speak truth to students.
Yeah. Well, do you think schools are prepared are equipped to prepare young people to work in climate tech?
I don't know. I mean, I think some of the more technical schools are, for sure. I don't know about business schools right now. I'm not like, I still think there's a long way to go with most business schools, where there's still, it's still always just about the prestige of the investment bank. Like these business schools, when I was there, and I don't feel like it's changed too much, it's like the 3 paths you have are consulting, banking, or corporate, or consulting and then corporate. And so that's a while ago, but I don't necessarily feel like they're celebrating this stuff. It's still kind of like there's a sustainability track, or there's a sustainability, semester or something like that. But it's not the kind of core of, it's not core the way it needs to be if we really believe this is a climate crisis.
Yeah. So looking ahead, let's just limit it to 2024, the year. What are some of the trends and topics you're tracking closest right now?
Well, everything's had a tough go with funding for the past couple of years, but alternative proteins has kind of for sure. There's a lot of money being fed into disinformation, and a lot of lobby money going into the food and meat industries, and dairy especially have notoriously big budgets for lobbying. So I'm watching really closely how that is being put out and how it's being countered, and seeing some green shoots about like getting slapped on the wrists for making false statements by politicians. But that has to be kept up, because although if you go into a grocery store, every week you go there are more products, alternative products, and consumption is increasing. But you wouldn't know it by reading the news or that type of thing. So that's that's really important to me. And I feel like, especially as we see AI and generative AI and voice AI coming about, we're going to start seeing disinformation, which already plays a massive role out there, playing a bigger and bigger one. So that's something that I'm keeping an eye out for.
Well, you brought up the grocery store, and it reminded me of a question I'd like to ask you. What does the ideal Ryan Grant Little grocery store look like? The grocery store of the future?
It has like 20 varieties of super spicy buffalo wings that are either plant-based or from cultivated meat. I always joke, people assume, a lot of the time, because I'm in the food tech space, that I'm kind of like this foodie, and I'm totally not. And like, I'm a junk food guy, and it's, for me, it's not about my health. It's about like planetary and animal health. And that future grocery store, I will go into it and buy like 10 types of chicken wings and bring them home to my air fryer and go on vacation for a week in sweatpants. That's my ideal grocery store, plus, times vacation.
Wow.
And I just saw that Lindor has come out with a vegan line of chocolates, these ones that are like in the
wow.
So that popped up on my LinkedIn. I'm very excited about those. So these kinds of things, yeah.
And you've been vegan for how long?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I've been vegetarian for almost 20 years, but I've been vegan for like less than a year, fully. And it's still one of those things where like, I'm just sitting there in a cafe. I'm like, oh, I'm eating a croissant. That's not vegan.
And getting back to the topics, is there anything on your bookshelf that you want to shout out to listeners?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, at the moment, I mean, not just at the moment, I generally read a novel every week or every 2 weeks, and that's more and more a form of escape that I really need. So I'm not reading a lot of industry books or climate books. I'm getting a lot of that stuff through LinkedIn, through conversations, through like that type of thing. I recently, this is going to sound so pretentious, but I recently reread Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which is the one that, like as an undergrad, you're supposed to walk around with just to look cool, and that most people never actually read. And it just reaffirmed that I think it's the best work of fiction that is like, at least of our lifetimes. And I don't know, have you read it?
Yeah. And I would ask you, why do you think it has such a following among tech people in particular? Because whenever I get into conversations with it, it's always with somebody from some permutation of the tech world. and they always love it.
To be honest, I didn't know that it had a following in the tech world. I know it has a following kind of in like the New Yorker, coastal liberal elites and stuff like that. So I guess that scans.
Well, lastly, Ryan, do you have any advice for me as I go on to host podcasts for Impact Europe?
Well, so first of all, let me say thanks. I mean, this is a great way to hand over to you. So this is episode number 25 of Sound Fun. I guess this is a crossover episode, but
crossover episode. It'll be on both, right?
I'll put it out also on another ClimateTech podcast, so it'll be triple threat crossover episode. But it's episode 25, and so I'm super happy to be handing over the torch to you, and I think your role there as like the chief storyteller is a super important one. So for me, the advice would be, please find ways to keep telling these stories, and also to find the stories, that aren't just kind of, popping up in front of you or so obvious, because some of the people who are doing the most interesting work, aren't the ones with 10,000 followers on LinkedIn and at every conference and stuff like that. So to find those people, the gems out there, I think is really important, to give them a platform and a way to talk about this stuff. And to keep asking why. I think like a la Simon Sinek, that a lot of times the deeper questions and the kind of understanding the implications or the motivations are really important. So not just like, what are you doing? What's the thing? But why? And why does the world need this? And how are you doing it different? And kind of these secondary questions. And then the last thing I'd say is just to be of service. So I really tried to be of service to both my audience and to the guests. And that meant a lot of times connecting people, and, people have been hired because of the podcast. People have raised money, funds have raised money because of it. All kinds of great things have happened, connections made. And so, I would continue to think of that as a kind of tradition of service with the podcast, which is, I think, that was my motivation to start it in the first place.
Wow. Ryan, all of that advice truly, truly resonates. If I had to pick one piece of it, it's the why question. I really do love asking people why, just on a human level. I just feel like I need to know. So listeners can't see this, but I am raising my coffee cup and cheers to you. Cheers to why, to asking why. And if I may make one correction, I have been very flattered that you have called me the chief storyteller, but I am not the chief of anything. I am but a humble storyteller. And if I had my druthers, I would keep my job title to just storyteller.
Vice storyteller.
Vice story, yeah. Yeah, maybe someday, Ryan, maybe someday. Thanks again for joining.
Ben, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.